In this video, I want to go over some Bible passages that I have offered through a handout called Key Passages in Redemptive History, or the meta-narrative of the Bible itself. In a previous video, I talked about that the Bible's meta-narrative has, could be simplified to creation, fall, redemption, recreation, or the renewal of all creation. Creation, fall, redemption, recreation. And that's good, and it's very sound, it's very biblical, but it's nonetheless a kind of simplification. And if you're going to walk through the Bible, it's usually not presented as quite as simply as that. You have to go through the Bible. There's a series of passages that, if you're more attuned to the underlying fundamental meta-narrative that the Bible itself presents, there's a certain kind of, some details and special vocabulary that the Bible presents that leads to the culmination of all of redemptive history in Jesus, which that proclamation is called the gospel. Now, what I want to do is take you through some of those key Bible passages. And really, quite frankly, if you go through this, it'll help you really understand the Bible. If you can know, it's kind of like the key stepping stone verses that'll take you through the Bible. It'll really give you a whole understanding of the world and of history and of creation. And so that's what this is for. I could have chosen some other passages. There are other passages I could have thrown in, or maybe chosen this passage, but this set of passages will help you. So it could simplify it maybe even a little bit more, but this will help you get to see the unity of the Bible and the story that the Bible is presenting, which, the scholars, if we want to use a little bit more of a tighter, instead of like a more simplified meta narrative like creation, fall, redemption, recreation, some scholars have called redemptive history. So one last comment before we start looking at the Bible passage. It's very important that we look at the Bible's own self-understanding of the grand story, the grand meta-narrative of the world and history, because what human beings have regularly done is use some other man-centered grid. So like, some classic ones in the modern world would be like a Marxist grid, or a feminist grid, or that's popular in some churches is a prosperity doctrine kind of grid to look at the Bible, and then they're cherry picking Bible passages to let you know, like, this is what the Bible means. But it's really important to see what is the Bible's own presentation, and that's really the case I want to make for you today. We're calling a redemptive historical hermeneutic. Hermeneutic means a kind of has a coherent, systematized understanding, a systematized interpretation. This is the Bible's own self-revealed hermeneutic interpretation, and it goes back to Jesus, and I want to make that case for you through this. So let's go ahead and take a look at this handout now. So here we go. Let me share it. All right, hope you're looking at this. Well, let's go to the top. Key passages on the redemptive history of the Bible, which is the Bible's own presentation of its meta-narrative, the true meta-narrative of the world and all of history and creation. So it all starts in Genesis chapter 3 right here. And it's this verse. So often, this isn't, it's a famous verse, but people don't tend to memorize this verse, but you should, because scholars have tended to call this the proto-evangelion, which literally means the first gospel. This is the first time the good news is said in the Bible. It's in chapter 3, and it's right after the fall. So chapter 1 and 2 are creation. The world is pristine, it's beautiful as God made it, and again, it's good, it's very good. Then God says it's not good. Then he makes a wife for Adam, and then they fall. And after this is God pronounces curse, but then he pronounces promise. This is the first time. So if you take you to Genesis chapter 3:15, here he's speaking. This is God. I will put enmity between you and the woman. He's talking to the serpent. And between your offspring and her offspring, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Genesis chapter 3:15. And so who is the serpent? This is the devil. And there's going to be one who's going to come from the offspring of the woman, and this offspring is really going to bruise the head, is going to really crush. This is a way of saying it's really going to kill and destroy the devil, the one who has now helped, helped human beings fall off their purpose, which is that they were supposed to have dominion over all of creation under God, essentially be a kind of like rulers under God. The technical term is a vice regent. A vice regent is a ruler under a ruler. The ultimate ruler is God over creation. But then God says, my rule is going to come through these rulers. The vice regents have dominion over the earth. That was human beings. But then they were led astray by the devil, and now all of creation, has fallen. So now, but just after the fall, what we have is a tremendously important promise. It's the first promise of the way redemption is going to occur. That's why scholars have called the first gospels, the first good news. And here it's really important to see that the rest of the Bible is looking for this person, this special offspring that comes from Eve. Okay, so I really want to emphasize this because everything flows out of Genesis chapter 3:15. And then what the scholars who have deemed redemptive history is like, it's like a seed. Genesis 3:15 is like a seed that God gives us this word. And then like a seed, you look at a seed, and then, a mighty oak tree doesn't look anything like the seed. As the seed begins to unfold and grow, you begin to, first there are roots, and then then there's the trunk, and then there are the branches, and then there's the fruit, and then you have the whole fruition of what is coming out. That's what redemptive history is like. It's kind of like an organic process that's unfurling throughout history. And the Bible gives us the words and the meaning of this redemptive history that flows out of this seed of gospel promise in Genesis chapter 3:15, which was first given to us by God. Okay, so all of the rest, when we're looking at this, we're looking for who is this offspring? Who is this offspring? So let's go forward. What we have from that time as all this wickedness that the flood occurs, and the world is so wicked that God destroys all, and then he leaves just a remnant of people, and then ultimately he gets to one man, and then through one man he begins a process in history that will lead to this important offspring. And it starts here in Genesis chapter 3. And he says here, it goes, I will make you, verse 2, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will dishonor him, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Here we go. All the families of the earth shall be blessed, which is another way of saying all the clans of the earth. All the nations of the earth, because when we're talking, there's only so many families, and all the families go. We're talking about all the ethnicities of the earth. Okay, you get to Genesis chapter 15. Abram is following God. He's going to a new, but he's already starting to die because it hasn't happened, because he has a wife. She can't have children, and then he basically says, like, how's this going to happen? So I was just fearing. He goes, oh Lord God, verse 2. What will you give me, for I continue childless? That's really, really important. Because if Abram, whom God later calls Abraham, is he going to be the pathway that Genesis chapter 3:15 is going to be fulfilled? It's a serious problem that he's childless. And then God says, fear not, because it's not going to be through this guy Eliezer, you're not going to get any, it's not going to come through you. And then what God does is, this is tremendously important. It isn't just like God is a ruler and says, I already told this and you just have to believe me and walk along with this. That's not what God does. Instead, God makes a covenant. And what he says is, and then, he puts them, and then he makes a covenant. He says, and he put all these pieces, cut them in half, and laid each over against each other. This is verse 10. And when the birds of prey came down, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And then Yahweh said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring, here we go, there's that important word, will be sojourners in the land, etc. And then, this important thing happens, and then this pot goes through and goes in between the pieces. And really what it represents is, this was the way it was back then. If he who is more powerful than you makes a deep promise to you, he swears unto the heavens, unto God, that I will walk between, this cut apart animal, that if I'm going to walk between this, and if I do not fulfill my promise, may God, who seals this promise above us, cut me apart. So what's extraordinary here is that God makes this promise to Abram, and he goes through this. Abraham doesn't go through the pieces, but God does. So it's like he covenants himself to Abram, and he swears to himself. There's always there's three parties in a covenant. There's God, who is, the ultimate defender of the covenant, and then the two who promise, and one is usually stronger. So God is the stronger party, promises to Abram, and then he's promising to who's his promise to himself, because there's nobody greater than swear to. So Abram understands this. So Genesis chapter 15 is tremendously important. And again, Abram actually repeatedly kind of forgets and has doubts about this. And so the important passages are Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 22. Again, God repeats this promise in multiple ways. Again, but 12 is the first time it's given, and 15, this is where God covenants it. And again, it's back to this question of the offspring. So for sake of time, let's move on. Let me jump to Judges 21, 25. So this is now after the time of Moses, and now there's been series. The Israel has now kind of like gone into the promised land. They were a bunch of tribes. They've conquered the people, but not well enough. And then again, they keep falling to the idolatries of the local Canaanites. But they weren't under a king, and something new is starting to emerge in God's redemptive historical plan, and that is that there's going to be a king. In those days, there was no king in Israel, Judges 20:25. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so I know there's so much to be said there. The Bible has a complex understanding of kingship, earthly kingship, but really human beings, what we need is a king. So let's fast forward here. We get to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and in the redemptive history, something new is starting to emerge. It's kind of like I told you, it's like imagine if the seed has gone to the roots, and now the roots has gone to a trunk. So now a new reality of this, what is emerging from Genesis, the promise of redemptive history, the meta narrative, the grand story that God is doing to redeem the world, and that is a covenant with God's chosen king, and that king is David. And so let's find this passage here. And, just for the sake of time, I've asked you to read all these things, but I want to take you through this so that you can get a better understanding. And so let's see what I can find it. Verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So the ancient Israelites, they read this too. They're looking for this promised offspring, and they knew this promised offspring has to come from David. David goes back to the line of Abram or Abraham, and now we know that has to come. There's been lots of different offspring of Abraham, and now we know that this offspring, that's the special promised one, is going to be a king, and it's going to be the king of a very specific one of the kings, and that is David, so son of David. So that's why Jesus has to be the son of David. The Messiah has to be the son of David. Here's the next, let me offer you a next, which is that God is, reshaping the covenant. So God has made a covenant to Abram, which is really the way that is going to be the pathway that God is going to heal the world. But then he made a covenant under Moses to form a nation. He made a covenant under David, but now he's changing it. He's saying, I will make a new covenant. This is Jeremiah 31. With the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with your fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares Yahweh. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. And he goes on and says, verse 34, no longer shall, verse 33, I shouldn't stop this. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. It's not going to be just done on the laws that are above us, through a reign, through a theocracy, as God did under Moses, nor through a king. It's not going to be an earthly. In Jeremiah, it's like they're going to be, their nation is going to be destroyed, but instead God's going to do something new. You won't have a proper political governance. your temple will be, it won't be because but instead the covenant will be in your law, my law will be in your heart, and I'll be married to you. I will be your God and you'll be my people. It's covenantal language of union. And verse 34, and no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and his brother, saying, know Yahweh. Why? Because they will actually know me. They shall all know me, from the least to the greatest, declares Yahweh, for I'll forgive their iniquity and I'll remember their sin no more. So here, the point is less about some great, reign through a governance, instead that it will be that something deeply profound will happen inside of us. God's law will be on our heart and our sins will be forgiven. Let me go through a couple more passages in the Old Testament, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll go to a part 2, okay, before we do the New Testament of the meta narrative. So here, let me offer you something. This is a prophecy in Isaiah, and Israel was always expecting that this offspring was going to be a great leader. He has to be a king, right? He's the king, the son of David, but they didn't tend to pay attention. They love this view that the law will be in their hearts and that they'll be forgiven. But what is this going to look like? And so here we go. Let's go to verse 4, very famous. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten, smited, that is, struck by God and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, that brought us shalom. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And Yahweh, the Lord, has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So here, now the offspring is going to suffer. And scholars have called this figure a suffering servant. So again, it's like a knowledge is unfurling. And in order to really understand who the Messiah is, you have to understand who the Messiah is from the promises of God, from the Word of God. And one of the things that, so many of the ancient Israelites didn't seem to understand is that he had to suffer. And here's this picture of the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 52 and 53, famously Isaiah 53. Let me take you to one more, and I know I went over this briefly in the other video, if you've watched it, but this is really, really important. Daniel chapter 7, where there's a figure called the Son of Man. So let me just jump ahead to verse 13. I saw in the night visions, this is Daniel giving a prophecy, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, that's God, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations, and language shall serve him. His dominion is an everlasting kingdom, everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So they clearly understand this has to be the son of David. This has to be the offspring that comes from Abraham, and this has to be the offspring that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter. So the Israelites understood this, and really they're looking for this great hope that finally all the world would be healed. And prior to this, there's a series of beasts, and the beasts are really the oppressive and wicked empires of the world. And these, one of these empires destroyed Israel. This is Babylon, and they were one of the beasts. And this is really a history. History is a series of beasts, but one that is ultimate. That is, he is this like a son of man, and this son of man is going to be the one that will ultimately be the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3. Genesis 12, 15, 2 Samuel 7, and Isaiah 53. And all these are giving us the proper picture of how history is going to come to culmination and who is going to do it. And I'll stop here. This will be part 1, and this will conclude, this will take us through the Old Testament before we finally get to Jesus. So let me stop this recording here, and this will be the end of part 1. And we haven't gotten to the good part yet, where finally the one that the gospel is pointing to comes, and you can see how he's the fulfillment of all these promises in the culmination of this history.